Well, firstly, just want to say thank you and welcome to this webinar on scale management. And, I think as we thought about this, we realized that the appropriate licensing and translation and implementation of the scales that we choose to use for patient-reported outcomes and clinician-reported outcomes in our clinical trials is essential to make sure that we can generate reliable study endpoints. And so we're also aware that sometimes this licensing and implementation of validated scales can be a challenge. And that's really why we wanted to bring together a webinar on this topic. So if you go to the next slide, please. So just before we get into the main meat of this, I just want to have a few housekeeping items that I wanted to go over. We're going to be asking a couple of poll questions during the webinar. And in fact, there's one coming up very shortly. You can access these by accessing that URL, thepollev.com/signant866 on your mobile device. There's actually a link to it in the chat as well on the webinar. So please access that, and we'll use that to answer the polls as we go along. The second is you're going to be in listen-only mode for this webinar, but we really do want to try and make this interactive and answer your questions. So please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions at any time through the webinar, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. And then also use the chat option as well. If you're having any trouble with the audio or with seeing the presentation, just let us know. We'll do what we can to help you resolve that. And then finally, as you leave, we'll ask, there'll be a survey that will pop up, and it would be really helpful. We'd be so grateful if you'd answer that survey. Just let us know what you thought of the topics and the presentation today. So if you go to the next slide, please. So before I introduce the speakers, I would like to just open up with the first poll question. And it should pop up on your screen. Again, you can access it with the URL that's above there, the pollev.com/signant866, or you can text signant866 to that short code. And as you can see, we're asking, what are your biggest challenges related to acquiring and implementing scales? And we've got a few points here coming up. So it's a word cloud, as you can see. So you just enter one or two words, and you can enter multiple ones. And we'll see how this builds up. Looks like licensing is a big one by the looks of things, but there's translations, there's timelines in there as well, which isn't surprising. Choosing indications, choosing versions. Yeah, really interesting. Just give you one more minute and see where we go there. Great. Okay. Well, thank you. And maybe we'll close the poll at that point. But it seems to me, licensing is there in big letters. So that means a lot of people answered that. Timelines as well. Requirements. Maybe we'll drill into that a little bit as we progress with this talk. But I think these are very common things that we hear as well. These are the sorts of issues that we commonly discuss and hear with clients. So let's move on. Let me introduce our speakers for today. So we've got really pleased and honoured to have Michelle White with us. Michelle is Vice President of Consulting Science Services and a Senior Scientist. Michelle, that's so hard to say. It's a real tongue twister, that. At Quality Metric. And she's worked in patient-centered research and outcome measurement for over 20 years. I think many people on this call will know Michelle very well. She leads the scientific consulting business at Quality Metric. And then with Michelle, Carrie Crocco. She's a scale management architect here at Signant Health. She's got 15 years of experience in scale management, localization, and all the associated services. And at Signant, Carrie guides sponsors and CROs and our internal project teams through scale acquisition and implementation processes. So welcome to Michelle and welcome to Carrie. And finally, I'm Bill Byram. I'm VP of Product Intelligence and Positioning here at Signant Health, and also a principal eco-scientist providing science input into studies and products here at Signet Health. So really great to be here. We're looking forward to a super webinar. If you go to the next slide, please. So I think just in terms of what we're going to be talking about, in our webinar today, we're going to consider scale management from a license holder perspective. And so that's really Michelle's part of this presentation. And then we're going to consider some of the practical challenges and pitfalls to think about when working with validated scales. And Carrie is going to present that. And then finally, just at the end, I'll take a very brief look at how we select an instrument in the first place. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Michelle. And Michelle, the floor is yours.
Great. I will just request control. Thank you so much, Bill. And it looks like it worked a half hour ago. Let's do it. Aha. Okay. Thank you all for being here. As a scientist, I use many different types of clinical outcome assessments across a wide variety of studies. But I have to say that I am here on behalf of Quality Metric, where I work, and we do license many commonly used patient-reported outcome measures. Hopefully that experience will be a help to you today. My goals are to talk about the driving forces behind most instrument developer requirements, providing some examples of what can go wrong if those are not followed, and providing some best practices for working with instrument developers and ECOA companies from my experience, and to answer some questions. The driving force from my perspective behind instrument developer requirements are really to uphold the scientific integrity of the instrument. And that ensures that research is interpretable, and that can only help patients in a healthcare system. The last thing you want is someone using an incorrect version or scoring it incorrectly, and somehow that getting through to publication and missing an important finding. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about today. So in order to help avoid disasters, I'm going to use my next few slides to talk through some common pitfalls of clinical outcome assessments. And I've done so in framing it in terms of fallacies. And we've all heard of different fallacies out there in the world. And I've made a few up. The first one is the Google's got my back fallacy. So this happens on a daily basis. We see someone who, rightfully so, is interested in using a clinical outcome assessment, and they say, I'm going to go to Google and find this instrument. If you do that for SF36, hopefully our company comes up. If it doesn't, you might find any number of websites that put something out that might not be the correct instrument at all. I'm going to give you a very simple example today, and this actually is part of our instrument, in which a student contacted us and they had gotten something online, but what they got was a sample that someone had put up and it didn't include all of the items. Missing items affects ability to score and interpret data. And a lot of the times, the false forms that are out there don't have the right wording on the questions, don't have the right wording on the response choices, don't have the right number of response choices. And when you get to different translations, you might not even know if you did see the real form, whether it matches or not. Getting the correct form is very important. 99 times out of 100, what you find online is not going to be right. The second pitfall I wanted to walk through today is what I call the I know a guy who knows a guy fallacy, or in this case, I know a guy who knows a scoring algorithm. And this is related to, you know someone in your office who's done this 1,000 times, and they provide you with an algorithm for scoring. In this case, I've taken from a fun article on a algorithm for a fake news website. So this is actually not an instrument scoring algorithm. But it makes the case. Let's say someone knows how to use SAS. You figure you can use this. You program something in, and there you go. You're off to the races. You think you're fine. If you're lucky, someone realizes the outcome doesn't seem right and checks it. Let's say in the condition you're working in, you realize that physical functioning should definitely be affected. You've looked at other literature and you realize that everyone else who's used this scale has seen an impact there. What is going on? And maybe you go back and check and try to get it scored correctly. Several years ago, my good colleague, Mark Kaczynski, wrote a paper called, a short piece called Survey Says Get the Data Right. And it has a lot of different examples that very well articulates what happens that causes people to have information that's incorrect in their scores. And in some cases, this can really cost your company a lot of money. If you're putting in a lot into a trial, and this is an outcome, whether it's a primary, secondary, or exploratory outcome, you really want to make sure that what you're using is the correct form and it's scored correctly. Otherwise, it's all wasted. The third one that I'm going to go through is a couple of examples of the "we don't have time for this" fallacy. And what I hear often is, we don't have time to go through form review. We have our own QC processes. We'll be fine. Well, I assure you that we review over 100 forms every day, and many of them have errors every single day. I'm giving a few examples here. This one is on a UK form of English and the asthma control test. And not only is this spelling a US version of nebulizer and the parenthetical is not included, but also while the response choices are not incorrect, they're in the wrong order, which could lead to wrong scoring based on the scoring instructions. Another example of the "we don't have time for this" fallacy with form review is an English form for the country India. And in this case, someone has programmed a little bit instead of slightly. And third, I have one in Japan for Japanese. And not only here has the programmer put the response choices left to right instead of vertically, if you look in the middle, there are the wrong characters used. And third, the character breaks are in different places. And in many languages, where you place a character return can change the meaning of what it says. Some of these characters have to be put together. So this is a very important consideration that could lead you to have invalid study results. To tell you a little bit about the form review process that we use and many instrument developers use, specifically for quality metric, after programming in your own QC process, the ECOA vendor or whomever is programming it submits their set of screenshots to formreview@qualitymetric.com. Our scientific team conducts a review. We send a review form back that lists any errors that must be corrected, and that process gets repeated. And we're going to talk a little bit about timelines, but the faster that you turn this back to us and make the corrections, the faster we can review it and get back to you a final form review that's marked as passed review for that particular language and country and instrument. At Quality Metrics, some of the things we do to ensure fidelity and quality are that we have a team to help you select the correct instrument and version for your study. We provide instructions and sample screenshots along with the instrument to guide electronic implementation. That way, from the very start, you know what it should look like, and that will help reduce the time to get that form review passed. We have an automated survey distribution system. So once the order is put in, what is sent to you is absolutely the correct version. It's very important for you internally and with your ECOA vendor to make sure that that communication and handoff happens if the person who completes the licensing process isn't the one actually using the form or scoring. We require form review services to catch those errors in the reproduction and programming. We have standardized software, which includes multiple types of setups to find what's right for you, which could be a standalone software, a cloud-based, or an API. And the API connects to different systems, and that makes it very easy to get real-time results. We have dedicated scientists that answers questions from users every single day. And we work proactively with ECOA companies, CROs, and study sponsors to help find efficiencies. And some of that is in our partnership program where we can work with you to have form review libraries so that you have different programming already set to be used to allow you to skip the form review process, and also setting up communication and prioritization and an API connection. An example of answering the call for help, we respond to most inquiries within 24 hours. Some complex scientific questions might require a call or up to 3 days for senior review. And this is when it gets to our science team. So sometimes people go to the wrong group or something, but once it comes to us, we are very fast to turn around a question. Here I have a question from a student who is using the SF-12 and had some questions with missing response items, specifically on the physical function and mental health scales and whether or not the component scores would be missing also, and on our maximum data recovery options. We asked what version they were using first and answered the questions actually within 3 hours. And this particular student came back with a follow-up question that was specific to their study and the types of analyses they were doing. And within 3 business days, our chief science officer provided a detailed written response. So different developers are different. Not every group has this, but we do have a group who try very hard to answer your questions accurately as you're using our surveys. I noticed in the word cloud that timelines was a big question. And Carrie's going to talk a little bit more about this as it relates across the different developers. For us at Quality Metric, in reality, it sort of depends. If you already know what you're using and you provide all the information you need for the license, it could take 1 to 2 business days because we have that automated process. So that can be very quick. If you're not sure what you need to use, obviously that can take some time to sort out first. If you don't know what countries you're going in, you don't know that sort of thing. We have more than 190 translations of the SF-36 V2 and over 150 of the SF-12 and many other translations. Not all of these are fully converted to our tablet and handheld versions. And there is a difference. The SF-36, as you know, has been around a very long time. And so it starts with mark the 1 box on the form. Well, in electronic implementation, you have to change that to select the response. In addition, many of those forms have a grid presentation, which separates out the item stem and the rest of the item. And we have to have that in 1 item at a time, say for a smartphone version. So there's a few things with tense and stuff like that that has to change. If you're wondering how long this takes, if there's no existing translation, which rarely happens in many of our forms anymore because we have so many, it can take 7 to 10 weeks. If you need to take an existing paper or pencil translation and turn it into an ECOA version, that takes about 3 to 4 weeks. For form review, our average turnaround times, the first review that you send is 3 to 5 business days. If there's an error when you send that back to be re-reviewed, it's usually 1 to 3 business days. I want to note that if you send more than 5 at a time without advance notice, the 3 to 5 business days is not guaranteed. And we have up to 2 weeks, 10 business days to do that first review. So we strongly recommend for these reasons that you have a kickoff call with all parties to understand the roles, identify key contacts, and set priorities and expectations for your study. I can't say it enough. If you have something that involves multiple countries, if you're doing something with 60 different translations, you really need to make sure that everybody involved knows what's going on. That might involve the developer, the translation group, if that's a separate group, and if it's needed, the ECOA company or vendor, and the group that's going to be using the tool later, and really keeping those open and being very up to date on any timeline changes and any prioritization changes can really help ensure that you stick to the right timelines. And it also helps who's going to be doing what when. It's important to know the different options available for your clinical outcome assessment and that you license the correct one. I've seen many times when I've done a form review and I've seen that someone programmed the acute version, which is a 1-week recall for the SF-36, and they wanted to use the standard version. They'd licensed something that wasn't the right one that they wanted, and everything had to start over through no fault of the ECOA vendor or the developer, really. So these things are really important to make sure that you have in advance, especially when in many companies, a procurement group is the one doing the licensing. You need to know what mode is required. Do you need a paper pencil version? In our instance, we have both a tablet version, which is set for a diagonal of 7 inches or larger, or a handheld version. Why do we have 2? Well, because we've been doing this so long, there were no smartphones that were doing things like this when we first created that single item version. So we had that tablet version. It has instructions on every single screen, whereas the smartphone doesn't fit all of that language and it breaks it up in a little bit of a different way. So it's important to think about these decisions and know what you're going to use. If you're going to use a bring your own device or a mixed mode, we go with a least common denominator approach and ask that you use the handheld or smartphone version so that everyone is seeing the same thing. Are you going to use a full form or a shorter form? Especially if you're working with something like an item bank or an item library, know the rules around the individual items and groups of items. Is it an instrument that requires a certain core be used and then additional items can be added? Or can you pick and choose anything from the item bank? These are really important things to make sure you know before you start. It's also important to know the licensing process and requirements. I can't tell you how many times in a study uh, it's decided 4 or 5 months in to add an instrument and someone has no idea what needs to be done. In those 4 or 5 months, any translations that were needed could have already been made and available. So really try to think about those things up front. You also need to know what are the requirements from the developer. In our case, we do our own development of translations so that we can control the quality and ensure that we know exactly what was done. You need to know form review requirements and scoring requirements. Not only do you need to know what are the requirements and that you have the right version, but let's say you chose an API connection. Have you already worked with your IT group to make sure that can actually be done? So think about how this is going to happen later on and make sure you're on top of it. And then think about any other forms that are needed. If you're using an ECOA vendor, we would have a business associate agreement to ensure that that ECOA vendor has the rights to use our survey also. If you're going to be sending data to us to score, then you would need to have a data sharing agreement in place. So think about all the different paperworks and forms that might be needed, and we would help you walk through all of those. So that ends my section, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and really, really good insights and great to hear the perspective of a scale owner like Quality Metrics. So that's really helpful and interesting. I was kind of interested that one of the pitfalls that you talked about was you showed where people had actually changed the question or the item wording itself. And, you know, I think we know that sometimes that has to change between, for example, language versions. If you've got a culture or a country where, you know, perhaps lifting a gallon of milk or walking a block isn't really something they understand in their culture, then you have to come up with some different wording to explain that construct. But I think what we saw there was a different example of just changing the wording for a different reason, perhaps. And, you know, perhaps you could just explain to us just briefly why the wording is so important, and maybe perhaps some of the processes that you as a scale developer go through to validate the exact phrasing that you use when you have a question and the response options, for example.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. There is a lot that goes into scale development, and those who do it know it can take years and a considerable investment to ensure that you've included the correct processes and people. So for example, there's not only the initial development and the gathering of information about the concepts and what should be included in the measurement, but then there's additional processes for content validation of the instrument. That includes cognitive debriefing or other sorts of testing to ensure the wording makes a lot of sense there. And then, of course, there's psychometric validation. So that can take a long time. When it comes to other countries, you mentioned a really good point about examples that can change, like bowling might not be applicable in all countries or other types of things. And we follow, you know, ISPOR and other best practices that include, you know, 2 separate forward translations, a reconciliation, a backward translation, developer review, et cetera, very detailed process that includes cognitive interviews with individuals to ensure that the understanding is there, that it's understood by the people taking the test as it was intended by the developer. If you go and change the wording, you have a problem there. It's not going to be accepted by regulatory. It's not a good idea if it's not regulatory. And furthermore, you just don't know then the responses that you're getting back, whether or not it's really answering the same question. It affects the reliability and the validity of the responses. There's so much that's gone into some of this testing, and it's just, it's interesting to me the number of times I get a call and someone says, I think it sounds better this way, so I put it in. And they do, and I try not to laugh. Sometimes it's a programmer who's not even going to use it in the study, and they say, well, I thought this sounded better.
Yes. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And a couple of questions that came in online, maybe we can just very quickly
Sure.
address those. So one was to ask you specifically about quality metric. So do you allow sponsors to have master service agreements so that they can have efficiencies when it comes to study specific licensing?
There is. We have master license agreements with companies so that they can fill out a quick statement of work to have a really fast start. And beyond that, again, we can also do the sort of partnerships that have things built up in advance so that you have things ready to use as you need them. And also, if you work with our consulting science group, we do the master services agreement also.
Great. And then one thing that I thought was a great question, actually, you talked about the screen review process and making sure that things are represented in the right way. Do you have another review process for the scoring coding that is done by a vendor or a sponsor?
We don't, but we do require that our software is used. And so that's tested, and it's been reviewed hundreds of times by many different vendors, auditors, et cetera, to ensure the accuracy, so that what you put in, as long as it's put in right with the right variable names, and what you get out is correct. So we can do a certified scoring process ourselves, and we can verify other people's scoring if they would like to, and that requires a data sharing agreement. That is something that we offer when people are worried about it.
Brilliant. Now, thank you, Michelle. That's really helpful. Great. Well, we'll come back to you shortly with more questions. And please, for those of you listening, if you've got more questions for Michelle specifically, please do continue to put them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them at the end. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I think we wanted to ask another poll question just before we move into Carrie's presentation. And this is a multi-select. You can select as many options as you like on this one, but really just to get your experience of the types of pitfalls that you've experienced in your organization or personally when it comes to using validated scales in clinical trials. So quite a lot are saying translation challenges and timeline issues. That's really not surprising. A few more mistakes in electronic implementation, the next one down, and then wrong versions creeping up, and scoring errors. Yeah, so, but the two top ones, which I guess we're not surprised by, and I'm sure Carrie will touch on these as she goes into her presentation, are around translations and timeline. So thank you again for doing that. We'll stop the poll at this point. And yeah, really, really pleased to hand over to Carrie to talk about sort of the practical aspects and best practices around scale management from her perspective. Carrie.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I just wanted to put this out there first that I'm not going to get into specific scales. This is just a general overview for copyrighted scales. I know in the beginning, the word cloud had mentioned the licensing was a bit of a pitfall. And now, of course, timelines and translations. So what you're going to see a bunch on my slides is allow time. So I'm not going to even say this over and over again, but it's absolutely true. So getting into just the general overall for for licensing of copyrighted scales. When do you license? Sometimes you'll see, and I know we're talking a lot about ECOA and electronic implementation, but we still do have plenty of times where paper administration is used as well. Sometimes there are paper scales actually available for purchase on copyright holders' website. If you're not sure if you need to have a license for these paper scales, if you're using paper, of course, when in doubt, check with the copyright holder. I can say this over and over again too. If you have questions with scales, check with your copyright holder. Now, what I can tell you on the overall process is Michelle did a fantastic job on quality metric and how well they have their process down, their screen reviews, but you're not going to just have possibly the SF36 in your study. You could be working with, depending on your protocol, you could be working with 15 to 20 different copyright holders, and every single copyright holder has a different requirement. So this is the biggest challenge, and I'm sure those of you that are on this webinar right now may have experienced it, and if you've experienced it, you know some of the heartache, that's for sure. But it does get tough. Trying to understand all of the requirements from copyright holders and put it in the correct timelines for your study. So again, going to constantly say, please allow time. If you have multiple copyrighted scales in your study, you need to allow the time to license and have correct permissions. Some things that just do occur within just the overall process of licensing. You might even, something as simple as just having the order of signatories on your license. Does the copyright holder have to sign first, or does the licensee have to sign first? Seems very minor, but could affect your timelines. Licenses can also be based on a number of different things. So as I mentioned, different copyright holders have different requirements. You've got your length of time. How long are you going to use the IP? Number of administrations of the scale. How many languages do you want? And all of this is based on per study. Some copyright holders also have a minimum amount of administration. So say you only need 10, 15 administrations, doesn't matter. They may have a minimum requirement of maybe 100, maybe 1,000. There's so many different requirements out there that you really have to know each and every scale, which of course is always challenging. Legal reviews within there as well. Most of the time you're signing a license, there are legal terms in there. So you want to make sure that your legal group is involved in these types of reviews. Payment of invoices. It's possible copyright holders will not release a scale until the invoice has been paid, or you've shown them, or you've given them a purchase order. All of this you need to keep in mind. And again, allow time. Potential for ECOA requirements. Licensees for ECOA vendors. You might need to have a license as the ECOA vendor. So sponsor might be handling licensing, but that ECOA vendor may have to be involved from a licensing perspective to at least sign the ECOA agreement. Michelle talked about these screen reviews. I'm not going to get too much into this, but this is possible as well. You have to find out from each of your copyright holders if they do require this this type of review, and it's part of your license and permission. So again, allow time. Next slide, please. Okay, so also sticking with the licenses, getting your permissions, you have your initial license already for your study, and you've done this based on the information you had at the start of your study. We all know things change. Copyright holders know that happens as well, so that's not a problem. But again, allow time for amendments. Some copyright holders require an amendment, some may not. So again, every scale is different. You have to reach out to the copyright holders directly, finding out if amendments are going to be needed. If they are needed, it's possible because you're adding a new country, adding a new language. Again, this always changes what you thought in the beginning of the study with so many countries. Maybe a country drops. Maybe you need to change it for whatever reason. If countries and languages are located in your license, you're going to need an amendment, and you're going to need to get permission from that copyright holder to use the IP in that country and that country with that language. If you're increasing administrations, possible that start of the study you had figured a certain screen fail rate. Turns out 6 months in, not exactly what you thought. So it happens. Copyright holders, again, know this happens, but you want to make sure you're staying up to date on your number of administrations within your study. You may have to license a specific amount of administrations. So you want to keep that up to date, making sure that you're getting permission to use the IP for a longer amount of time, especially extension of LPO. Next piece is your, again, thinking that your last patient, last visit is going to be a certain time. Well, especially with COVID, for a great example, everything kind of paused. And of course, those studies that had paused during that time may have then needed to be extended. So you'll have to go through to those amendments and check to see what is absolutely necessary from the copyright holder. Again, allow time. Next slide, please. So see, here was just a brief summary of the source version translation challenges, just some things that we've seen, as doing licensing here at Signet to source confirmation. This is definitely can be a bit of a challenge and really requires, the sponsor's protocol. Is it final? Are we starting work before a final protocol comes? This happens, it absolutely does happen, but it's really tricky, again, because timelines are always such a big concern, is weighing the pros and cons of this, of when to start the licensing, because it is possible something like recall periods there could be scales that have recall periods of 1 week versus 4 weeks. And depending on your schedule of assessments, you're going to have the correct source version. Otherwise, this is going to screw up your data. So timing of that final protocol and when you're actually doing the licensing and acquisition is key. So you need to discuss within your team how that's going to be handled. Also modifications. Some sponsors, because of their protocol, may want to modify a copyrighted scale. Not always allowed, that's for sure. If it's a copyrighted scale, you better go and get your permission to make sure that you're allowed to modify it. And if you're modifying it, then you need to make sure that any translation availability may now be affected, because if you're now modifying the scale, it's very possible that translations are not fully 100% available now either. Going over to the mandates for translation process, Michelle talked about this with how Quality Metric handles their own translation, which is great. So you'll know at that time when licensing with Quality Metric, they do their own translation. They have plenty of translations, which is fantastic, but this isn't always the case. So you need to make sure if you have translate, or if you're going outside the US or even US Spanish, for instance, you need to be sure that you know the translation requirements. Some copyright holders mandate a process because they want to make sure their IP is translated consistently, regardless of the language. That could involve cognitive debriefing, those cognitive interviews that Michelle mentioned. That takes time. So if that's a mandate, then you need to allow time for that as well. Also, copyright holders may want to have review of the translation as well. Again, takes time. So continuing to say, allow time. Also, if you do have permission to translate, you want to make sure, obviously, you have the right version. And then does that copyright holder have a mandated translation vendor as well? That's also key to make sure that you have all of this information ahead of time while you're doing the licensing. So then you can set yourself up once the translation comes to know what those timelines are going to look like. Next slide, please. And here, of course, can it get any more complex? Sure can, when it comes to licensing. So just some 3 pieces that we just pulled out here just to mention quickly. Supplemental materials with some scales. I know some scales are just questions found on 1 page of a Word document. Not always the case with there's so many scales. I can't even count. I don't even know how many scales are honestly out there, but there are so many, and more are coming up over and over again. So you could have stimuli books, you could have manuals, you could have kits, like if anyone's familiar with the ADAS-COG. All of these pieces need to be included as you're doing the licensing permissions for your possible trial. International publishers, this is something we've come across where maybe your copyright holder is here in the US, but they've given rights over to their publishers overseas, and you have to go to individual countries and receive possibly only the hard copy scale. So again, I know we're talking a lot ECOA, but paper as well still might need to be used and only have permission to be used in certain countries. So you have to find all this information out ahead of time to really help, with the timelines. And then of course, things change too, which I'll get into in the next slide. But the purchase requirements, just purchase orders, how many you need, those types of things, and also printing requirements here, visual analog scales. Really, they need to be, if being printed, they have to be a certain length. If they're not the certain length, then they're not valid. Also something that seems to be simple, but sometimes we've run it, there's been issues as well. A4 verse letter. Of course, the US likes to be the US. So letter, that's what we like to use with all of our printing, but everyone else in the world uses A4. Could be a big difference, so keep that in mind. And my last slide is just the constant changes. So I know I've mentioned, please make sure you allow time because I know timelines are a sore point for everyone when it comes to licensing. So I constantly, even internally at Signet, we say this all the time, please allow time for this work to be done. You may only have 2 or 3 scales in your study, which is great. But if there's one scale that may take four months to license, unfortunately, that's going to be your holdup, which is, of course, what I've listed down here at the bottom. But make sure that you're just checking. And even as Michelle said, oh, I know a guy, he did this before. It's great. And experience is always great, but there are always changes happening within licensing of these scales. First, there's new scales that are coming. You may have a change of actually the licensor. So who you licensed with last year may now have actually switched over to another group. So you can't then just rely on that experience. They can change fees, they can change any kind of requirements. Maybe now there are ECOA requirements that now more and more it's occurring because ECOA is starting to become the norm and people are moving away from paper. So it's all fine and the industry is obviously changing, but you then need to make sure that you're getting all of the correct requirements for your specific study. Licensing is usually done, well, almost always done per study, unless, which the question came up about the master agreements, that's a possibility too, to be able to do that to maybe help with timelines as well. And again, my last piece is here, a study is only good as the most complicated license scale. Again, it really just goes into the fact of knowing your protocol, how many copyrighted scales do you have in there, what are your permissions, what are your requirements, and if you have one, unfortunately, that's going to take a really long time, then you just have to allow for those timelines for that most complex scale for licensing as well as implementation of it as well. So how'd I do on time, Bill? Okay.
Yep, you did good. You did
Okay,
good. Thank you,
great.
Carrie. And just look, a question that's coming online that I think I might ask you now. And Michelle White, stand by because I've got a follow-up question similar to this for you as well at the same time. So the question is, often timelines aren't in our favor. Have you found copyright holders will work with you in some way to help achieve timelines? What's the experience there, Carrie? But I guess good and bad, but are there any good examples?
I was going to say, yeah, I guess it all depends. That's for sure. And copyright holders absolutely understand timeline constraints. Again, those master agreements may be really helpful for sure. But I think going into it, if you can at least give them a heads up on the timelines of what your timelines are at the very start, I think they'll appreciate that for sure.
Great. And sort of linked to this, Michelle, I guess what a creative suggestion, I think, coming in, the fact that we don't get, as vendors, we don't get the questionnaire documentation until the contract is signed. Have you thought about maybe a bit more of an open access approach where you can make the stuff available ahead of contract? So actually some of the work can get done, before the contract's signed. Michelle, you're on mute.
I swore to myself I wasn't going to do that. We have multiple options for doing that. One is sort of the partnership thing we talked about, which we could do through study sponsors working with us and an eCOA vendor, or directly with an eCOA vendor, which is to say we can have these things already ready for you and just have an agreement that we partner together. I know we work very closely with Signet. We're very careful about the different groups that we do work closely with, and we work with those that we trust, and others, other groups as well. So that's one way. We also can distribute a sample copy and our quick start guides or other manuals or materials. We distribute those pre-licensed all the time, and you can make use of our scientific advice services without a license regarding our service, regarding our instruments.
Great, thank you. And Carrie, do we see that with other scale author owners as well as Quality Metric?
Yeah, exactly. You've just got there's just always a range, right? So
yeah.
So it's trying to keep the all the copyright holder requirements organized, to say the least. Yep.
Great. Okay, well, we have a few more questions, but I'm just going to go through the last part of the presentation. I'm going to go through quite quickly and talk a little bit about instrument selection. So maybe go to the next slide, please. So I think before we include a COA instrument in our study, we need to think about, is it addressing or measuring a meaningful aspect of health that's important to patients? And so this is an example in relation to physical activity. So we might consider a population that's very inactive, like COPD, for example. And if we ask the patients themselves what aspects of activity are important to them, they might say things like we have there at the bottom of the slide: I want to be able to walk my grandchild to and from school, or I want to do more for myself around the house. If you click again, I think once we have that, we can then start to develop, okay, certain different aspects of health that are interesting, physical activity related and perhaps sedentary behavior related. If you click again, and then that helps us to then develop concepts of interest. So for sedentary behavior, we might be interested in how long they spend sitting or lying, or how many times are they standing up and sitting down over the day. Or for physical activity, because they're doing these interested in these short bouts of activity, perhaps we're interested in how many times can they have a purposeful walking episode in a day. If you click again. And that helps us to then start to develop an endpoint. And as you can see, where we've been leading with this one is, this is an endpoint that's perhaps more suitable to be measured with an activity monitor or wearable device. But equally, we could be saying, okay, I'm going to measure a number of purposeful walking episodes with a patient diary or some sort of patient reported outcome measure. So really, it's only at this point that you decide the best way to measure it. But the point here is we're trying to link back to making sure that what we are measuring is a meaningful aspect of health for the patient. If you go to the next slide. And I suppose taking that then further, once we know the concept of interest, we need to understand the different constructs or domains that kind of make that up. And so this is an example of the conceptual framework for the non-small cell lung cancer symptom assessment questionnaire. Again, a bit of a mouthful. The important constructs are kind of listed here, and that's sort of cough, pain, dyspnea, fatigue, and appetite. And then associated with each of those are different items that start to measure those domains. And that questionnaire has been developed through patient research, doing concept elicitation studies with patients to figure out which domains should be measured and are important to the patient. And then further interviews and research, like Michelle had described, to make sure that the way that those items are then developed and worded convey the right meaning and interpretation to the patients. And so I think, basically, so going back from identifying meaningful aspects of health, linking that to concepts of interest, and then determining whether there are instruments out there that measure those concepts of interest is really one of the key things about selecting an appropriate COA instrument. If you go to the next slide. I think what's been really interesting recently is the FDA draft guidance on patient-reported outcomes in oncology trials. And historically, FDA have rarely accepted label claims for oncology treatments that are based on endpoints from patient-reported outcome instruments. This isn't the case for the EMA and other European regulators, but certainly is the case at FDA. And one of the reasons for that is that often the FDA don't consider the instruments to provide measures of the concepts of interest that are interesting, but that are specific enough to make those measurements. So in their draft guidance, we kind of summarize here, they identify measurement domains that they consider pertinent and important to measure in patients in oncology trials. And those are disease-related symptoms, symptomatic adverse events, the overall impact of side effects, physical function, and role function. But those need to be measurable as discrete concepts of interest so that they can be evaluated by the regulator independently. If you go to the next slide. And they identify in the guidance a small number of instruments that kind of meet that criteria for specificity. So if you worked in oncology studies, you'll recognize some of these. So obviously the non-small cell lung cancer questionnaire is there that we've already looked at. The Pro-CTCAE is an adverse events self-report instrument. And then you've got things like the EORTC, the QLQC30, the physical function subscale of that instrument they've identified as being specific enough for the measurement of physical function. So we just look at a couple of examples, if you go to the next slide. And here is that physical function subscale for the QLQC30. And if you just look at, just naively look at the face validity of this, you can see that the types of things it's measuring are all related to physical function. We've got things about strenuous exercise. We've got 2 questions about walking. We've got some information about sedentary behavior. We've got some information here about self-care activities, etc. So they all seem to be very related to that concept of physical function. So you can see that why that's perhaps determined as a very specific instrument. If you go to the next slide, here's another example. This is the FACT-B instrument that's often used in breast cancer studies. And you can see in this particular domain, what they call functional well-being, it's not quite as easy to map these items to a common domain, a common concept. You know, if we think about it, we've got I am able to work, but then you've got also my work is fulfilling, and those seem to be measuring quite different things. And then the fourth one down, I've accepted my illness. Again, perhaps these are measuring sort of things that seem to be quite different. That's not to say that the FACT-B isn't a valuable instrument, because it is. But as we think about the FDA requirements, it might be that we have to start to redefine or define different subscales of items within their questionnaires that help us to map more directly onto those core domains that the FDA have identified. If you go to the next slide. So I think I just wanted to finish my whistle-stop tour really with just a summary of how you select, I think, a patient-reported outcome measure. So start with the understanding of meaningful aspects of health. Use that to develop concepts of interest that help to measure those meaningful aspects of health. Identify instruments that measure these concepts of interest if they exist. And then evaluate some of the validation work that's been done around those instruments. So look at the concept elicitation work, make sure that these are appropriate for the disease indication that we're interested in. So is it comprehensively addressing those the concepts for that disease? And then finally, look at the specificity of the measures and the subscores that we think are important to increase the potential of labeling claims based on those endpoints. So if you go to the next slide. So I just think, yeah, I really wanted to just finish off with having another look through the Q&A. Again, I hope you've all found that useful. I'm just having a quick look through some of the other questions that have come in. Michelle, one for you here. It's really just some interesting observation about the RAND version of the SF36, the version 1. And really how do quality metric ensure that sponsors understand how to use the appropriate scale for a commercial use versus the old RAND version of the V1.
Yeah, I think that question, as I saw in the chat, was related to KDQOL, which is a kidney disease quality of life questionnaire, which embeds another instrument. And sometimes it gets confused as to which instrument is in there, and it is the SF36 V1. So that, You do need to know what you're going to use and what you'll end up getting out of that in terms of the scores and the comparison to what's out there in the literature. You know, because that's really important to kind of compare your findings to other findings. In terms of the licensing portion related to these instrument specific scales that include a generic measure, again, I just have to say you have to look into what is included in that scale and how do you measure it and how do you license it and making sure you follow all of those requirements. I think there's probably 10 or 12 different disease specific scales that embed our instruments in there, and you do need a license for those.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thanks for that.
Mhm.
And maybe just a final question just to wrap up, and to both of you actually, and maybe Carrie, you can try and answer this first. And it's really when we're doing web-based ePro. So, you know, when we're doing web-based, we don't really have any control over what somebody's using. They might use a PC like I'm using now for this webinar, or they might use their handheld device and the browser on there. And if we look at something like the SF36, we've got different versions. Same with the EQ5D, we've got different versions for handheld versus tablet versus web. So what's the general rule? You know, what license should we request if we're doing a web-based study where we might have, you know, multiple different types of devices accessing at the same time?
Bill, you're putting me on the spot. No, it's, I don't think there's a general rule because all copyright holders are different. So I think what you need to do is go to each individual copyright holder, explain how you're going to be using the scale and find out how it needs to be implemented based on how they license.
I could tell you for our tools, again, we use sort of the least amount of text on the screen approach if they're going to be taking it on anything to make sure that it would be fit on all. And it's also the least expensive and the fastest process for you to only have to program once and control once and not have to ask someone at the beginning of the study, what type of device will you be using all the time through this study? So in that way, it's just the simplest thing to do. And you know, so that's why we have that sort of rule of if you were going to do a study that included all of those different modes, we would want to use the handheld or smartphone version.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Going with the lowest common denominator, really, isn't it? And I think that's certainly the advice that we give customers as well. Look, we're at the end of the hour. It's gone very quickly. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank you, Michelle and Carrie, for your time and for your insights. And also want to thank everybody who's joined, and I hope it's been useful and interesting. There are some more questions we've still got. We'll try and answer those by email. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.